Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
We are live from the See You on the Other Side, American Ghost Walks, What's Your Ghost Story, Hangout, Listener Ghost Stories, Personal Ghost Stories party today. I am your man, Mike. Coming on in is Wendy, my co-host, and Scott from what'syourghoststory.com. How you guys doing today?
Doing great, thanks. Yeah. How are you?
Well, hanging in there and having fun and, making sure that everybody's audio is on. So you guys make sure, put a comment or a reaction if you can't hear something or anything like that right away in the comments or reactions so we make sure. Also, we just got a heart for saying that. Thank you.
Hey, nice job.
We love hearts.
Absolutely we do. And also, joining us today is my lovely sister, ghost writer, paranormal researcher of the year in Milwaukee, Allison Joinlin.
Hey, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Yes, everybody. I just want to make sure to get everybody on the screen today, and so we can do some hanging out. So today we'll be recording episode 291 of the See You on the Other Side podcast. And that is going to be our favorite listener ghost stories, plus some personal ghost stories that we haven't shared on the air yet. Now, when we're talking about like our favorite ghost stories and stuff, like there's stories that you get from reading them in a book. There's stories that you get, when you research in an old newspaper. But because we're in the business of the weird, we also get stories from people individually. And I mean, is that something you guys have noticed? Like if you tell somebody that you're like, oh, I like ghost stories, that some people are like, oh, you're a freak. And other people are like, hey, man, I got to tell you my story because nobody else believes me.
I totally get that because, I think there are so many people out there who have their own personal stories, but they don't know if you're safe to tell. They think that, I might be labeled a crazy if I tell someone my story. So they know I'm a safe person.
Well, I know I went on a first date one occasion, and it came up that I wrote a book on ghost stories. And it was certainly one of those one date only types. And she's like, you didn't publish it under your real name, did you? I'm like, oh, okay, I see how this is going. So, and, I even had trouble. I rented a room one time and somebody, they researched me before renting the space to me and they found my ghost story webpage and like, I don't know if I should rent to this guy. And he confessed later that like his son had talked him into it, that it's okay if the guy's a ghost storyteller, that he lives under your roof. Yeah, it's kind of unreal to me that there is that much of a stigma.
Well, and I've noticed, as we've been attending more and more paranormal conferences over the years, that's really a safe place where people feel free to open up and share their stories, much more so than anywhere else, of course. I mean, obviously it makes sense. And especially when they find out that we work in this field, we have a paranormal podcast, then it's like a much more easy platform for sharing things like that.
Well, I tell you, I discovered pretty early on that when you had, when you put up your shingle or whatever for haunted history and stuff, that people would start communicating or calling in stories, maybe not even anything that had to do with your haunted history tour or like not even an inquiry on like, hey, can I get a group together or anything, but more like, oh my God, like calling you like they would call the Ghostbusters is.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of and also on the American Ghost Walks tours, I've noticed that, when I've been guiding in the past, that, people come, of course, for the ghost stories, but they want to come there as a forum as well, to share their own stories and to hang out with other people who have their own stories as well. A lot of people are looking for a forum where it's safe to talk about these things.
Well, I tell you, just to kick it off with a story that I thought was interesting was that, I was contacting people on Twitter in the early days of marketing the podcast. And, I was saying like, hey, if you like Mysterious Universe or Darkness Radio, you might like See You on the Other Side that me and Wendy are doing, just trying to get them into it, writing songs. And all right. So, and I remember, this is from March, 22nd, 2014. So I believe, it's probably me and you are driving back from you know what? This was even before the podcast. I'm sorry, but we still would have been driving back from South by Southwest when I received this email, and I immediately sent it to you, Allison. And it's somebody that sent this long message on Twitter saying, I need some kind of help. Something's going wrong. And then I'm like, well, please send an email. And I thought it might be like, okay, maybe we can do an investigation or something. But it ended up being a little more sinister than that. His email the title is Possession. I just sent a message to Twitter asking for help for my fiancée has been having some issues in her sleep. And at first I took them as night terrors. But when she started responding, she looked at me and her eyes were black, not hers. I started to think that this might be something more than night terrors. All right. I can see why you'd think that. And so she would say things like, he is coming. Don't take me. I don't want to go. But then she would start choking, gagging for breath, eyes wide open, and I'm holding her helpless. I then grabbed my voice recorder just to get some of the things she was saying on tape. And when I turns it towards her after grabbing the recorder, she sits straight up, in my face, her eyes black, and she cocks her head, smiles, and lays back down. She'd then say things like, he has been here for a long time. He won't leave. She'd say I was a fool and that he will kill me. I put the voice recorder in between some pillows, and she's laying with her back to me, sleeping with her face to the wall. She turned, and I tried to hold her from turning, but she pushed me right off her, smiles, her eyes still black, and says, he knows. I said, he knows what? She reached out and went straight for the recorder. There was no way she knew the recorder was there. She smiles, cocks her head, calls me a fool again, and that my foolish ways would do nothing. She asked me over and over, That part gets a little dirty. But let's just say she asked him to have sex with her, the sexual relations with that woman. Okay. And then when that was happening, she would start choking. She would stop breathing, and then she'd fall asleep. And then terrified, and then she'd fall asleep until 4:00 in the morning, and then get back up and not remember a single thing that happened. She'd wake up crying, saying he will never leave, and that it hurts and that her stomach hurts. And the story goes on and on for another few paragraphs of all this kind of stuff's happening. He's like, it sounds far-fetched, I know. And I'm not a religious guy, but I asked God for help. And he pretty much said, I can't help you. I don't know what's going. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm causing more of an issue by recording or by talking and acknowledging it or whatever this is. I don't know, and I'm getting scared. I don't know what to do. Please help. Now, Allison, do you remember me sending you that at all?
No. Sorry, I don't.
No.
We get a lot of stories.
Help is on the way, sir. Help is on the way.
How could you forget? That's the feel-good story of the year.
Yeah.
I'm like, nope. I don't know. Sorry. I didn't help him. I feel terrible now that you read that to me. He needs to
I think I said to
the
him,
Catholic Church.
I responded to him that he should probably he should start by taking her to the hospital and see a psychiatrist. I'm like, start with that.
Sure.
Start with the psychological stuff and then let the devil, worry about the devil later.
Yeah, because the Catholic Church is going to do that anyway. They're gonna have their own psychiatrist look at you.
True.
And evaluate you.
Now, I would say to anybody who is in that situation where somebody approaches you with something as serious as what this guy was talking about. Like, the thing is, I was trying to make sense of what he sent me because it's all like one run-on sentence. And I probably wasn't the best person to send it to at the time because we're in the middle of traveling back from Texas, probably still hungover from that week-long of South by Southwest on the tour.
And you weren't at, your full power to battle the devil at that time.
Right.
Being all hungover.
I'm also the last person who's going to know what to do to fight the devil. That's not really something that I'm an expert in. I could go to his house. I could, videotape his girl. That sounds bad. To the story. But I could try to set up some kind of surveillance so we could see if we could capture any paranormal activity on tape. But to in a situation like that where it sounds like he thinks that his girlfriend is possessed, and not just possessed by the spirit of I'm a horrible girlfriend and I hate you, but the devil, he knows about the recorder in the sheets. You got to call a psychiatrist. You got to call a doctor. Also, she might not be that into you, and this might be her way of ending the relationship.
Well, it's kind of elaborate. Instead of just saying, it's not me, it's you, or it's not you, it's me, I'm possessed.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like a Halloween episode of Seinfeld.
Yeah.
I can't get out of this relationship, Jerry. Just act like you're possessed.
Yeah, it's not you, it's not me, it's actually the devil.
Oh, I love it. So I thought that was an interesting listener story, and that was one of the first ones that we got. And I wanted to play some video footage that we have and play you guys some of our listener stories that they called in to share their stories with us.
Ooh, yay.
And so if that's all right with you guys, I'm going to share some of the stories from our awesome See You on the Other Side podcast listeners. And we're going to have to start with our man, Dr. Ned. Dr. Ned is a Patreon, and he called in to the 40 in line to share his ghost story with us, and let's all take a listen to Dr. Ned's story.
The thing that I've never been really one to see unusual things. I did see a possible UFO in 1965 or so at summer camp. It was up in the sky, just lights spinning around that couldn't be anything we know on this planet. But 2004, my son's grandmother died. She was 81, chronically ill for a number of years, and we buried her at the cemetery on the east side of Madison. Her cremated remains, and she had spent quite a bit of time at the Grace Hospice Center in Fitchburg. Wonderful place. And I knew the doctor who founded that place, Dr. Bill Rock. I almost worshiped the guy. And there was a walkway in front of the hospice care center where Nana, I'll call my son's grandma, that's who it was. I adored her, where Nana died, about 2 years before, I think. But something told me this day, it was July 5th, I think 2006, to go to the hospice here in Fitchburg and just walk along this walkway in front of the center where there was a stone for a lot of people who had spent time in hospice care there at a Grace. And the stone said, Nancy Both, world's greatest wife, mother, and grandmother. And below it was elbows off the table. You could not put your elbows on a table with this lady. You got smacked. My voice is kind of hoarse. I'm not sick. I just did a lot of speaking and singing the last 3-4 days. Anyway, so I got to the hospice care center. Just somebody told me to go there. I went along the walkway, looked at her stone. When I was looking down at the stone in this pathway in front of a Grace hospice care, it was an apparition. My son's Nana was right there. I could kind of see through her, but she looked at me. She looked a bit younger. All she said was, and I could hear it, I don't think she was moving her lips, but I'm okay, the time will come. Then she was gone. The whole time, about 15, 20 seconds, she just disappeared. I wasn't startled by it or afraid. I just said, wow, I don't understand what happened. And my son was very practical, just said, well, these things happen. And his mom has said every spring there's a cardinal outside her window staring at her. Birds don't stare for a long time. This one does. That's her mom. That's my son's Nana.
All right. Thanks, Ned, by sharing that story, that powerful story of seeing someone you respected very much.
Goosebumps.
At the hospice, who died in the hospice. But the things like that, like, that's not the kind of, that's why we were talking about happy ghost stories last week. That's not a terrifying ghost story. You know, Ned wasn't like, I saw Nana and crap.
No,
my
it was
pants.
more comforting.
He was like, I saw Nana, and I think that's a powerful thing.
Yeah, it shows continuance, and actually, a lot of hospice workers have their own stories as well. They run into a lot of strange phenomena, and I'd welcome anyone that has stories that they want to share. We had just so many great contributors that reached out, but I would welcome to keep contributing, and anybody can call 414-FORTEAN, FORTEAN.
Right, and we can always do a follow-up with more listener ghost stories. And, we have another ghost story from one of our Patreons that I'm going to read. It's from his book, but I wanted to see... Scott, I want to hear about one of your stories from the What's Your Ghost Story site, and one of your favorites that somebody contributed there. And then we're going to jump to Chuck Martin's story from his Stranger Than Fiction book.
Yeah, I mean, so many have already come to mind because just based on the stories we've already heard, the way one story kind of reminds you of another great story. And I eventually changed my website to whatsyourghoststory.com because I was able to see the importance of the community aspect of ghost storytelling. And I first put my book out, I self-published it in 2003, and I was very proud of it. But then so many people came out of the woodwork and started to share their own stories and share more information on other stories, that when my book was then picked up by a publisher and widely distributed, it was 100 pages longer, just getting all of the new information into it. And that's only hats off to community building. So I think it's very important to encourage people to share stories. So I guess I'll tell one that basically changed the story for me from the first publication to the second publication. And there's a place in Libertyville, Illinois. It's actually the cover location of the book. And I covered this story. It's called The Gate. And Libertyville is in the middle of Lake County, so north of Chicago, south of Wisconsin, kind of right in the middle there, the border of Wisconsin, that is. And it had so many outlandish ghost stories that it just seemed like a place that was kind of spooky visually. Therefore, it spawned a whole bunch of urban legend because it always, there's a big massacre of a bunch of kids that were killed by either a deranged school principal or an escaped convict, or all of these like very outlandish urban legendy stories. And so I covered it in my book in the folklore section and the urban legend section, just to say, hey, here's how stories change from like school district to school district. And I found that valuable from a cultural standpoint, and it also just interesting. And then eventually, the first thing that happened that kind of opened my eyes was I was giving a speech in Libertyville, and a woman came to hear me talk. And I talked about the gate since I was in its home turf. And she's like, well, after my speech was over, she came up to talk to me and said, I don't think I have to ask you a question now, because I came here to ask you why my house was haunted, but I live across the street from the gate. And hearing all these legends, like obviously there's something going on in this land, and my property is right alongside it, and I've got an actively haunted house. It must be somehow related. But eventually I got an email into the website, whatsyourghoststory.com, and it was somebody telling their story about they've heard all the urban legends. They were in high school, and he and a friend went to go check this place out for themselves. Now, how this area looks is that there's this gate, there's this pathway that goes for less than 100 yards, and then you get this huge stone wall and wrought iron fence gate that's open. And then this path just goes into the woods and keeps going. And once upon a time, there was a summer camp back there. There was an orphanage back there. Over the years, it was a lot of different incarnations. But now everything's destroyed. There's just woods. So now it's this huge ornate gate that goes nowhere, which I think is enough fodder for people to tell some scary stories. Well, like most people, this guy went with his friend, and they arrived full of anticipation and dread, and then they just see a gate in some woods, and it's actually not all that spooky. So this is kind of a letdown. Like, well, we don't want to just turn around and go home now. We kind of dedicated the night to this, so let's just go for a walk. We'll go down this path and go into the woods and just go for a walk. And so this is late at night, and just coincidentally or weirdly enough, it was the night. Oh, it's coming up. It was the night before Easter. So we have an anniversary coming up. We can try to, if we're allowed to leave our homes, we could maybe see if this happens again on Easter Eve. And the thing I always say about this is, for whatever reason, as kids, we always stayed up to try to see Santa, but it was never a thing to like try to stay up late and see the Easter Bunny, which is an even more spectacular thing to see. But so he and a friend, they walked until this path kind of came to a T intersection, but instead of going left or right, they saw a very thin footpath that wasn't even defined, but you could just see where the ground was trampled down a little bit. So they walked straight ahead. And it was around, midnight on Easter Eve, and suddenly they heard the sound of a whole bunch of kids playing. And he said, I know this sounds weird because there's so many legends about children, but we weren't even thinking about the legends. We just thought, like, why are there all these kids up so late at night on this night? And he said the sound of children playing started to get softer and softer and quieter, and they were just standing still listening to the sound and trying to hear now this pinpoint of a sound way off in the distance. And he said, and that's when the screaming started. And no conversation needed. They turned around and started to hightail it to the car. A singular scream, just screaming bloody murder. One scream would happen and go away as if a breath is being taken, and then another scream would happen. And each time they heard this scream, it was closer to them. And their fear, as they were running back, their car is now in sight. He was so afraid that the next time he heard the scream, it was going to be in front of him. That's how close the scream was getting. Like, this is the most amazing firsthand account I've ever heard of this location. I've always heard legends, but this is what happened to me. And I was so excited to hear this story because the first time, again, hearing a firsthand story from this location, I posted it on the What's Your Ghost Story page. And within a month or two, somebody else wrote in and said, I've been to where they're talking about, and yes, the screams will follow you there. So that's one of the most chilling. I got goosebumps right now telling it. It's such an amazing location and amazing story. And I thank people for sharing that kind of stuff.
Right. An experience that's occurred to others too.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy in a great way.
Mm-hmm.
I like it. The thing about going to see the Easter Bunny on Holy Saturday, though, that seems kind of nice. Like, seems kind of a nice thing to wait up. And the thing is, though, like, somebody can dress like Santa Claus and be fairly believable. You can be like, oh, that's Santa. But nobody's going to dress like the Easter Bunny unless it's like somebody like steals a costume from the Night of the Lepus or whatever.
It requires a lot of commitment.
Yeah, to like go into an actual Easter Bunny
and like only Andy Serkis could really pull off the motions of it,
Right, Gollum. My precious eggs. I think I told you about all those times. I think I told you one time about how, and we'll have a ghost story from Allison and my mother coming up. But I think I told you guys that when I was little and one time I got a broken egg for Easter because I was naughty. And they said, like, the Easter Bunny's not going to bring you anything because you were naughty. Then I prayed to Jesus that night that he would join forces with Santa and kick the Easter Bunny's ass.
Oh, well, it sounds like you deserved everything you got.
You understood the lesson you were trying to be taught, I see.
So I want to read you guys a ghost story from another one of our listeners and our Patreon. Charles Martin. Chuck Martin has been a fantastic Patreon for a long time for the See on the Other Side podcast. And he released a book that you'll be able to find in the show notes for this episode, othersidepodcast.com/291. And his book is called Stranger Than Fiction. And his story is about the closet of terror. Terror. Mama, my mother's mother, lived only a subdivision away from the house my parents had built together. It was a long ride, but my mother and I could actually bicycle to Mama's. Mama's home was the same tri-level design as our own. You'd walk up a short set of stairs to the front porch, step through the front door, and you were in the living room. On your left was a half flight of stairs leading to the upstairs bedrooms. Just past them was a closet, then past that a half flight going down to the basement. Ahead of you was the way into the kitchen and the dining room. To your right was the bulk of the living room. After my parents' divorce for a time, my mother and I lived with Mama in the basement. Back then, most of Mama's 8 kids had grown up and moved on. It was just her and my Uncle Joe. During the time my mother and I lived in the basement, I almost never noticed anything unusual. The basement was just a basement, filled with boxes of our stuff, some beds, and some furniture. Upstairs was another story. In particular, There was that closet door that was always shutting by itself. The unusual closet was in the living room, the one between the stairs going up and the ones going down. The door was set so that the hinges were away from the front door of the house. Any wind blowing in through the open front door would have pushed the closet door open had it been ajar. The wind would not have pulled it shut. But of course, that's what the door did quite often. It would abruptly slam shut on its own. It was fairly routine, and no one seemed to pay it much mind. In all fairness, it always seemed to happen when the front door to the house was open, with just the screen door shut. Looking back on it, I'll concede that it's very possible that a breeze blowing from the open kitchen windows through the house might have slammed the closet door shut. That's the rational explanation, at least. One nice summer day after we'd moved out to our own apartment, my mother had taken me over for a visit. She, my mama, and one or two of my aunts were sitting around talking. My Uncle Joe came walking downstairs from his upstairs bedroom, through the living room, then turned and made the trip down to the basement to do some laundry. I was busy on the floor, sitting quietly, reading a book or playing with toys or something. Suddenly, and as loudly as normal, the closet door in the living room slammed shut. I was startled, as were my mother, aunts, and mama, but they quickly returned to their gossip. In the past, I had questioned the slamming door. I had been told, with a smile, it was just the ghost. I never believed it. On this day, I decided I wasn't going to sit back and believe the story. I was going to investigate. I asked again why the door had closed by itself. As usual, my question was answered with, "It's just the ghost." As before, I wasn't believing it. I offered a hypothesis of my own. It was Uncle Joe playing a joke on me and hiding in the closet. This theory was greeted with smirks until I got up and started toward the closet. Someone tried to hold me back, but I was too fast and evaded their grasp. I crossed the living room, stood before the closed closet door, and began yelling at the closet, "Uncle Joe, I know it's you. Come out!" I was afraid at the time. Very afraid. No doubt my family sensed it. They laughed at me, chiding that I'd better be careful. Goaded on by their derision, I grabbed at the doorknob, intent to pull the door open and expose my uncle for the prankster he was. The knob wouldn't budge, though. Not one iota. Even at age 6, I knew that a locked door back then wiggled a little from side to side before rotation was stopped by the mechanism. Not this knob. It wouldn't budge. Someone was holding it from the other side. I beat on the door and yelled at my uncle to come out. When he didn't, I decided that I had had enough. I sat down in front of the door, crossing my arms over my chest and declaring I wasn't moving until he came out. A moment later, no doubt having heard all the yelling and laughing from my aunts, mama, and mother, my Uncle Joe walked up from the basement, demanding to know what all the yelling was about. I was stunned. If Uncle Joe was in the basement, I reached for the doorknob. Again, the women on the other side of the room cautioned me, laughing and snickering as they told me not to open the door. I was undeterred. I grabbed the knob, and it turned easily. I opened the door, and I found an empty closet. No one was inside it, just some coats and shoes. What the... The women were having a great time now, laughing and knee-slapping and yucking it up. But I wasn't giving up. I had seen the James Bond movies. There had to be a false panel in the closet, perhaps put in by my pawpaw before he passed away. I leaned into the closet, punching and beating at the walls, trying to find a secret panel. There was none. It was a regular closet with no other way out. The walls as solid as any others in the home. I was completely baffled and beginning to believe the supernatural I had seen on TV was not the work of fiction, but something that might just be real.
Wow.
Thank you, Chuck, for that delightful story.
Well,
Formative experience.
with the audience, the old women taking such pleasure in it, I believe that they were witches. I mean, like, yeah, we know what's up. We're doing this with our minds. Or with a spell.
Good point. Good point. She's a witch.
Oh, the
Yeah.
poor little
I felt
kid. That would
bad.
be so scary. And then you're just getting laughed at by your family.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
Okay, who wants to watch another listener video? I do.
Ooh, I do.
Okay, this one comes from Katie from the Ghost River Society. or the Wolf River Ghost Society. I'm sorry. So Katie from the Wolf River Ghost Society. She lives in Arizona now, but she's from the Fox Valley area, and she has a ghost story for us that's actually music related. So let's go see what Katie's up to.
A few years back, my roommate at the time and I would occasionally drive around the eastern half of the country selling T-shirts for a country singer who was opening for various national acts at the time. On one of these jaunts, we drove from Wisconsin to Alabama overnight, driving straight through thunder, lightning, tornadoes, etc. Needless to say, when we arrived at our motel at 4 a.m., we were exhausted. The singer's manager had reserved some rooms there for us, so we checked in and went right to sleep. The room was on the first floor with an entrance direct from the parking lot. My roommate crashed out on one of the two double beds, and I took the other one, thinking I would fall right asleep. However, I was apparently just too tired, and instead I laid there, awake, waiting for sleep to come. The light from the parking lot illuminated the room somewhat, so it was easy to distinguish furniture, beds, etc. in the half light. However, as I laid there, I noticed a large shadow enter the room from the door without opening the door. This shadow was completely black and blob-shaped. It moved slowly across the room in front of our beds and then entered the space between the bed I occupied and the wall. At first, I thought I was just hallucinating. After all, I was very tired. But what happened next was anything but a hallucination. Without going into too much detail, this quote-unquote shadow tried to climb into the bed and assault me. It was very real, very solid, and heavy. Its surface felt like old binder twine and burlap wrapped around a log as it rolled on top of me. However, I was tired and very crabby after a long drive. All I wanted was rest, and here was this darn hate trying to get past first base with me. So instead of screaming, jumping out of bed, and running away like any sane human might, I got mad and tried to push it off me. As we struggled, I could feel one part that definitely felt human. But as I was wearing underwear, it could not get past that. For probably 20 or 25 seconds, this thing and I had a test of strength until finally it seemed to give up and slide off me. The shadow moved away, back across the room, and exited the way it came. Believe it or not, I finally fell asleep after it left. The next morning, I asked my roommate if she had seen or heard anything. Of course she hadn't, but she had fallen asleep right away. Naturally, I would attribute this to a lucid dream and nothing more. The next night at the show, I was chatting with one of the locals, and just out of curiosity to see what she would answer, I asked if anyone had ever noticed anything different about that motel. She responded that yes, there were reports of odd happenings going on there, but she didn't know any more than that. So was it real or a dream? I've had lucid dreams that you wouldn't believe, but I knew they were dreams. This hate felt absolutely real. And as a postscript, when we went to check out the next morning, we found that we hadn't had a reservation at that hotel. Our room hadn't been paid for, but they still checked us in and let us go without paying. To this day, I have no idea where that singer and his manager were staying. So anyway, that's my story.
That is a very frightening story, and all too real for many people who report a variety of nocturnal attacks. I mean, that attack sounds a lot like an incubus, but I mean, these stories of the male demon incubus and the female demon succubus who come and attack you sexually in the night, go back for millennia. So this isn't the first time we've heard stories like this. They're quite prevalent throughout history and across cultures, in fact. So her story, it was really great to be able to hear it. And she said that, she did try to follow up and find out if there's anything unusual about the hotel. And then, found out that there was supposed to be a haunting, but never was able to talk to anyone who had the same level of experience she had. But the interesting thing is they did not have a reservation at that hotel, but the hotel checked them in as if they had and never charged them. So that's an unusual footnote to the story.
It reminds me a lot. I had and as we're all of us here are tour guides, some of the best stories that we hear comes from our audiences sometimes. And I was able to do a couples tour once where I just had two people on. It was kind of a date night thing. And I always like that because you get to really talk and it's more conversational than presentational. And you could tell, as I'm sure a lot of us have dealt with, like one person in the group really was excited about it. The other person was just kind of laughing it off and not paying that much attention and being maybe a little bit disrespectful even. And but eventually this guy asked me, he's like, what do you think about shadow people? And I said, and I went into the spiel about what the theories were about, like, there's a lot of different theories, but one of the ones that I like a lot are kind of like interdimensional bleed through, whether it's intentional or not, that there are these entities that will appear usually in your bedroom at night. And once they're seen, they fade away pretty quickly. And they're just kind of like observers. And then he told this story that was so extreme that I thought he was messing with me. I thought he was wanting to see like how far along I'd go with it. So I was super skeptical at first until he continued, and you could tell that he was actually fearful while he was talking. And he said that he'd been visited by a shadow person, but they didn't just disappear when he saw them, that he was attacked by them. And he said he was jumped and put into a bear hug from behind, and his arms were like pressed against his chest, and he was struggling to get free. And he said at one point he got one arm free, and he sent an elbow back into this being. And I said, what does that mean? Did it just go through the shadow? He's like, no, it made solid contact, like I just elbowed a human. And eventually it went away. And so amazingly, just kind of like the previous story, I had somebody else later, somebody that was in the Navy, and they were on board a warship, and they were attacked by a shadow person in their bunk. And it was very similar. They both described being caught up in a bear hug where they couldn't move their arms. One of the guys talked about the light coming through the window and then being able to see the silhouette of two people struggling. So like this thing was even casting a shadow while being a shadow. And in both cases, this is what was so chilling to me. And I'm getting the pre-goosebumps now as I'm talking about it and knowing what I'm winding up to. In both cases, I asked, like, how did the fight end? How did it finally go away? And for both cases, the person realized that they could not win the fight. And that's when it left.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, and so another thing I love is one of the theories, because, at first, shadow people were looked at as these observers. They just were in the room, and then once they were seen, they left. And now people are wondering, was that the first stage of the invasion, just observing us? And next is testing the waters. We're in phase 2 now, where they're kind of like getting to some physical tussles and then leaving, gaining some information, some experience points.
They're trying to beat us up.
Yeah. So I don't know what I always find it so amazing, because you think paranormal experiences, they're going to be somewhat linear. If somebody observes a shadow person today, it'll be the same as yesterday and the same moving forward. But they seem to be getting more bold. And that's creepy as hell.
Wow. That is extremely freaky.
Well, number one, I want to thank Katie for that awesome story and for calling in and sharing it with us. Next up, I want to share a story from Allison and my mother.
Ooh.
And Allison, I just called Judy again today to see to see if she could refresh my memory. And so if you remember anything differently of these stories, please feel free to jump in. All right. So these are some of the stories including one I hadn't heard yet today. So some of the stories from our youth. But so Allison and my parents were married in 1960, and they were married in Milwaukee in 1960. And they're newly married. It's 1961. They're living in Milwaukee on 20th Street, across the street from Union Cemetery. And Judy made sure to say today that she's like, well, it wasn't just like kind of on the street. She's like, it really was right directly across the street. Like you walked at the door and you saw the cemetery kind of thing. And that's how she described where they were living. It's about 11 or midnight during the week. So not on the weekend, they're already in bed asleep. She wakes up and she hears a light knock on the front door. Consistently bang, 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 bang. And she's like, oh, I don't know what that is. So she gets up and she continues to hear the knock, which is weird because they're not living in a house. They're living in a four apartment building, and they're on the second floor. And they're not expecting anybody. They're not even friends with the neighbors. They weren't even friends with the neighbors when we were growing up. They're not friends with the neighbors. And she's like, okay, it's bang. And it's not like an emergency, like somebody needs help or anything. It's just this slow knocking on the door over and over again. So she wakes Dad up, and Dad jumps up and he runs to the closet and gets out a rifle. You know, she didn't even know he had a rifle, but it was like a 20 gauge rifle that he had when he was a kid for hunting. Or whatever. And so she didn't even know he had a rifle. He grabs his rifle and runs to the front door. She's like, stop, don't open the door. And the banging continues. They both hear it, and they're both standing in the living room. And she calls the police. So she calls the police, and she says it's on a phone that's on the wall. That's the same wall they're sharing with the hallway. And so if anybody's in the hallway or footsteps or walking away or the door's open, they'd hear somebody. And as she's on the phone with the police, knock, 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 the knocking stops. And that's all they hear. And so they don't open the door again until the police actually arrive. And there was no one there. And she said she was just freaked out about it. She could hardly go back to sleep. And, you know, being across the street from the cemetery terrified her. And also the fact that the light knock and they didn't hear anybody go away. She said, I would have heard the door open because I was the same place that I was all the time when I talk on the phone. And you know Mom, Allison, she talked on the phone all the time. And she said she would have...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. She said she would have heard somebody opening the door or somebody leaving because she was used to hearing those noises in the hallway. So having that happen in the middle of the night, and obviously my father jumping to red alert right away, I'm going to shoot him, was...
Holy overcompensation, Batman.
Right. And the funny thing is, she didn't even know, like, they were just married for a year. She didn't even know he had a gun in the closet. She's like, I wouldn't have let him keep a gun in the closet. I didn't even know he had one. So she told us that story. But then another ghost story she told was one that had used to scare her when she was a teenager. And this one comes from her mother, Adeline, and our grandmother. And Adeline's cousin, her cousin's husband, had cancer for a long time in the 1950s. And one night, he wakes up in the middle of the night. He looks over at the mirror over his bureau, and he wakes his wife up and he says, I just saw an angel in the mirror. And then she wakes up and goes, what are you talking about? And he's like, I just saw an angel in the mirror. She goes back to sleep, and he goes back to sleep, and he doesn't wake up.
He never wakes up. Dun, dun,
right.
Dun.
And so my mother said when she was a kid then, or when she was a teenager, and even now, when she wakes up and goes to the bathroom or something like that in the middle of the night, she doesn't look in the mirror.
Oh, man.
Because she doesn't want to see the angel behind her.
Yes, because the angel might be coming to reap her.
But that kind of thing. But then again, but her mother, Adeline, also saved our Aunt Paula from a dream, and I didn't realize this. And so in 1983, our cousin, we called her our aunt because she was born 30 years before we were. But our cousin Paula, she was she was sleeping alone at the time because her husband had passed away from cancer the year before. And she said she has a dream where she sees her grandmother, Adeline, and Adeline tells her to move, or to move a little bit. She wakes up and she moves to the other side of the bed, and she falls back asleep. She said she woke up a few minutes later and there was a picture hanging over the bed, and the picture would have slammed into her head if she'd have been sleeping at the same, in the same place. So she had said that
wow,
her grandmother...
That's a new one.
Yeah, that's a brand new one. And Mom's like, oh, I never told you that before. I'm like, no! She said that Adeline visited her in a dream and saved her life. Because otherwise the picture would have banged on her head. And
wow.
And so she was a little bit of kind of an explorer herself. When Adeline was a kid, this was in the beginning she was born in 1897. So she's a little kid in the first decade of the 20th century. And she's growing up in a big family in Milwaukee before they had electricity. And so her brothers and sisters, when they'd hear a noise in the attic, Adeline was always the first to go explore, and then she had a candle.
Oh, man.
They'd send her up with the candle.
They'd send her up with the candle, and they'd say,
Adeline, you go first.
You got the candle. And so, anyway, it's fun because our parents are not what you call paranormal believers by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a lot of fun when they have little stories in the family of paranormal activity. And so I just wanted to share that one today because she gave me much more details about the knocking on the door. Like, I didn't know she called the police. I didn't know that Dad had a gun. She just said, we lived across the street from a cemetery and there was a knocking at the door one time. And I'm like, oh, well, cool story, Ma. But then today when she tells the story, I'm like, okay, it was a pretty cool story. So viewer mail. There we go.
Those are some really good stories.
We should do another family one. This is from Allison's nephew, Mike Jorlin,
Yes, that's a really good one.
who also used to be a ghost tour guide for the Milwaukee Ghost Walk. So
That's right.
let's hear about Mike's story.
In my childhood home, we had a number of interesting occurrences. I remember it was my birthday once, and I was up in our second story facing the stairs. I was sitting on the floor doing my homework, and I very distinctly heard footsteps come up behind me. And I was the only person up there, and I was facing the only way that anybody could access it. I remember getting up and just running downstairs. I didn't look behind me to see what might be there. But this wasn't the first time that something had happened at that house. Shortly after we moved in, my parents had heard noise upstairs in that same second floor, and that's where my brother's bedroom was. So they called up to my brother, trying to see what he was doing because it was past his bedtime and he should be in bed. And his response was, Mom? Dad? Who's up here with me? Now, they told that story to my great aunt and great uncle because we were actually the third generation to live in the house. And my great aunt and great uncle said that they had regularly heard people or somebody going up and down those same stairs. Now, because we were the third generation to live in this house, there was some history there. And it actually turned out that my grandma's brother had his bedroom in that second floor, and he had died untimely. He had died an untimely death. He drowned during the time that the family was living in the house. He didn't drown at the house, but it was while they were living there, and that second-story bedroom had been his bedroom. So there were numerous occasions over the years of us hearing footsteps up in that second story where his bedroom was. It never felt like anything malicious. You know, once we realized that there was a pattern here and my grandma told us that that had been her brother's bedroom, we kind of tried to recognize him as somebody watching over us, but there were numerous occasions.
Oh my God, that's terrifying. But actually, I mean, it's really especially cool when you can connect a number of stories to an actual event or an actual person that had lived in that place. So we want to thank Mike for sharing that story. And oh my gosh, we have so many stories. Who's next? I think, Allison, you haven't told a story yet.
So Mike, you wanted me to talk about the Loria Manor. Remember that one?
Oh, absolutely. And what I think was cool about this particular story is that you sent it to me and you CC'd me on an email that you had sent to John Tenney wondering if he could do some investigation on it. Yeah,
I emailed John Tenney just because I had met him and I was like, oh, hey, he investigates in Michigan. That's his home state. So I was like, I should send him the story that I learned about when I visited Michigan back in 2011. So in 2011, for our summer vacation, Scott and I just went on a haunted road trip. And what we did is every night I scheduled it so that we could stay at a haunted location between...
and this is Allison's husband, Scott, not...
That's right. Yes.
Just to be clear.
There's lots of Scotts in the world. So my husband, Scott, and I were on this ghost story vacation where we just wanted to take a haunted road trip and stay at a haunted place every night. And it got problematic when we got to Calumet, Michigan. They have a haunted theater opera house there. And so I wanted to see that and take the tour. But then after that, we were like, oh no, we want to stay at another haunted place, but we don't know one around here, and we stayed too long. And so as luck would have it, we met some elders who live in the area, and they just like adopted us for the day and even had us come over to their assisted living center. Yes, we know how to party. Anyway, so we hung out with them, and then near the end of the day, we're like, uh-oh, we don't have a place to stay. And then so we were talking to them, of course, about the haunted places around town. And they said, well, we have heard some rumors about the Laurium Inn, the Laurium Manor, which is not far away in Laurium, Michigan. And they're like, well, you could make it there, in like 15 minutes. And we're like, okay, that's the place. And so we went to the Laurium Inn, and then this older lady checked us in. And of course, I waited for the opportune moment to spring it on her. Well, are there ghost stories about this place? And she said, well, it used to be a funeral home. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I had heard that. But are there any ghost stories? And she said, oh, well, those teenage girls are always talking about this place, of course. But you can't believe anything they say. And I'm like, well, okay. And then we went up to our room and had a really lovely night. It's a beautiful, beautiful, big mansion. And it has like 3 floors, I think. And we were on the top floor in one of the servants' quarters. But it is just an opulent place with incredible woodwork and stained glass all over in very artesian type designs. It's really an awesome place, even if it wasn't haunted. But anyway, so we went and stayed in our servants' quarters, and it was perfectly blissful. Nothing scary happened until the morning. So in the morning, there was a big clawfoot tub, and before we went down to breakfast, because it was a bed and breakfast type place, I was like, I'm going to take a soak in that big soaking tub. And so I was really relaxed. And then I heard like some loud sound. And I was like, was that outside? Scott, what was that? Was that a dog? And he was like, no, that wasn't a dog. That was a blood-curdling scream from inside the house. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's weird. And so I eventually got out of the bathtub, and we went downstairs to breakfast and also to investigate. And so we got downstairs to breakfast, and then this place was actually owned by a husband and wife. And we were talking to the wife in the dining room there, and she said in response to, I was like, hey, what happened? We heard like some scream or something. And she was like, oh, yes, I am so mad about that. I am angry. If anything like that happens again, they're out of here. And we're like, whoa, what happened? And so she explained that there was a family staying there that was essentially 2 parents and a teenage girl. And then all of a sudden, at the time when we had heard the scream, this young girl bolted out of the room where they were staying, screaming her head off through the hallway, screaming bloody murder. And then the parents were able to grab her and pull her back into the room and quiet her down, and then apologize to the owner. But I was like, wow, is there something more to the story? I mean, it wasn't yelling. I mean, I know about yelling and being a difficult teenage girl. So
you don't say.
It wasn't anything I recognized. It was like a blood-curdling scream. It wasn't, yelling as in an argument. So that was very peculiar to me. And we ate our breakfast, and I was like, oh, man, what would I do if I was on the television show Freaky Links? Well, I'd probably stay here for the weekend, but we're supposed to go see the Paulding Light. And
wait,
I'm not sure if anything more is going to happen
instead of
here.
saying what Kolchak the Night Stalker would do, instead of saying what Mulder and Scully would do, instead of any of the great ghost hunters, even the guys like Hans Holzer, who you're like, he's kind of cool, but kind of a proto Zach Baggins, you're like, what would the cast of frickin' Freaky Links do?
Yeah. What would Derek Barnes do? Anyway, so this is what I was thinking.
Instead of Peter Venkman. Oh, God, Allison, you're breaking my heart.
I'm sorry. I think that show was ahead of its time. Anyway, and you used to think that Derek Barnes was real, so don't even go there with me.
Hey, they got me. I was an internet sucker. Welcome to
internet sucker.
Welcome to the 21st century.
I remember before that show premiered, this is like a show from 20 years ago on Fox, and Mike was like, the summer before that show premiered, he's like, this guy, Derek Barnes, he's got this cool website, it's called Freaky Links. I mean, maybe we should get to know him.
Yeah.
And then it turned out that, these same people who put out Freaky Links actually were behind the Blair Witch Project. This was a project after they gained that fame. And so, of course, they're famous for harnessing the internet and making up things that become part of reality. And Mike got sucked into that.
And making guys like me look like assholes. Thank you.
I'm like, what would Derek do? And I was like, oh, man, I should totally stay, but probably nothing's going to happen. And how am I even going to track down that girl and get her story? I'm probably not going to be able to talk to her. So I was like, well, we'll just go see the Paulding Light. But before we do, we'll talk to the husband when we're checking out. And we'll ask him again, because you got to be persistent. Is this place haunted? And then, of course, he started with, it was a funeral home, right? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I know it's a funeral home, but that doesn't mean it's haunted. And then he said, well, did you know about the double murder-suicide? And I'm like, dude, you had me at double murder. And I'm like, what? And he tells me this really crazy story, which seems like an urban legend, but it's not. It's all true. Anyway, he told me that there used to be this couple that owned the place when it was a funeral home. And they were getting quite elderly. And their son had a son who was very difficult. And so their grandson is living with his parents in another nearby community. And he does something crazy. He's like not quite right. He's a little bit unhinged. And he sets a fire at his school. And actually, instead of hurting anyone else like he hadn't, I guess, intended to do, he got caught in the fire and became terribly disfigured.
Oh,
so
man.
After this happened,
well, he did start the fire.
Right, but the parents didn't know what to do. And so they thought, well, maybe he needs a change of scene. And they sent him to live with his grandparents at the funeral home. Now,
oh boy.
Unbeknownst to anyone else in the family, Maynard, the elder, the grandfather who owns the funeral home,
don't confuse him with
got
Maynard
a diagnosis that
different guy.
What was that?
Sorry,
yes.
Making a joke. The only famous person
Maynard,
I know named Maynard is the lead singer of Tool.
Okay, I think you're a Tool, Mike. But anyway, besides that fact, so Maynard owns this funeral home, and he's always been a really responsible, trustworthy person. But what happened was his wife had been sick for, about a year or so before they took in their grandson. And then he found out after a routine doctor's appointment that he had a terminal illness. And he just felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. How was he going to take care of his wife and his troubled grandson? And so he came up with a solution, which was to kill them and himself. And he actually laid out the burial clothes. He had all the burial clothes and all the paperwork done ahead of time, and had everything hung up in the closets, and noted that, this is what so-and-so should wear in the casket. And he had all the arrangements set up before he committed the murder. So he committed the murders and then committed suicide. And I was like, what?
Wow,
I can't believe this.
Yeah, it's a crazy story.
Then, after I left, I was like, this can't be real. And I go to my newspaper archives, and I find it right away. They have lots of information about this couple and about Maynard and how he planned everything so meticulously, and how, the detectives were saying how everything was so neatly placed to take care of the situation. And then I thought to myself, too, after this was confirmed, that what better ghost to terrify a young teenage girl than a disfigured teenage boy?
Oh, yeah.
And
that would do it.
Who would be, why would he haunt her? Well, I mean, he never got to grow up, and he's still an eternal teenager.
Sure.
And of course, teenage boys are going to be interested in teenage girls. And then I recalled what the assistant had told me the night that we checked in, that, this is the place that the teenage girls in particular talk about all the time. And I was also able to verify the story from a community forum as well. People in the neighborhood who had lived there for decades just started messaging about Maynard and about what a nice person he was, and how this was just such a surprising and tragic turn of fate.
Wow.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That was deeper than I thought it was going to be, Allison.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a long one.
From just the email you sent to John Tenney, back before I even know who he was, from just the email, that ended up being a lot heavier than I thought it would be. But that's a pretty cool ghost story. Then you even have
That's
some experience
awesome.
there.
Right.
So
What a story, too.
yeah.
I mean, even the non-ghost aspect of it.
So I think those are some pretty good ghost stories for episode 291. And to all the people that were on and joining us, we want to thank you very much for all of the ghost stories that people called in. If you guys want to learn more about us, OtherSidePodcast.com is a great place to go. If you're looking for haunted history tours that I've written, Allison's written, Scott's written, Wendy's led, you can find that at AmericanGhostWalks.com. If you want to see Wendy and my cool band, go to sunspotuniverse.com. And Scott, if they want to give you a ghost story themselves, where can they go and do that?
Yeah, definitely. It's whatsyourghoststory.com. And also head on over to YouTube and just search for me, Scott Marcus, Markus. I post videos up there, do some live streams, do mini documentary type things. But as always, it's the comments and the conversation that is the most important part of building this paranormal community.
Absolutely. And, the thing is that I think that now that people know that we're doing listener ghost stories, we might do it again. And the more stories we get, the more episodes we can do on it.
Yeah, definitely. And we still have stories that we wanted to share today, and we've run out of time here. So if you called and left us a story but didn't hear it today, we will include those in the next. We'll have a sequel to this episode of listener and personal ghost stories. But we definitely appreciate everyone who called in. Thank you.
So feel free to call Allison's special phone number, and that's 414-14. Or Allison, if people can't spell, what is that number?
Okay, 414-367-8326.
And if that's not it, someone's going to get some really interesting voicemails soon.
That's perfect. All right, so everybody have an awesome week. We're going to do it. I mean, the thing is, we're stuck inside indefinitely, so we're doing some more of these and ranking up some more podcast episodes and getting some more ghost stories and having more paranormal discussion for you from the live stream. So everybody, stay healthy, and obviously, it looks like it really looks like we're all close to each other, but we're all in different locations. So don't be fooled. We are socially distancing. And you should be too. Right. That's Scott's a hologram.
I'm chiming into the holodeck here.
Holodeck.
Wendy virtually.
All right, so we'll talk to you guys soon. This week's song is inspired by my own family story. The one where Allison and my mother told us about her uncle that saw the angel in the mirror in the middle of the night, went back to sleep, and never woke up. So that seemed to be the perfect inspiration for this week's Sunspot Paranormal Song of the Week. Here is The Angel in the Mirror.
Far beyond its bloom, only petals on the floor. A broken flower wilts, it won't be pretty anymore. When you hear the knock, there's nothing left to beg for. How I fought and how I tried to keep the lock on this door. Blinded by the love as she holds on to me. The angel in the mirror is the last thing I see. Wake up in the night, scared and breathless from a dream. When I open the door, I find her ready for me. Open arms and a crooked smile. It's just a tiny mercy. The war is over. I close my eyes and finally sleep. Blinded by the love as she holds on to me. The angel in the mirror is the last thing I see. Blinded by the love as she holds on to me. The angel in the mirror is the last thing I see.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
One of the most fun things about today's episode, Wendy, was that we got to feature a couple of stories from our Patreon community.
Yes.
It was super exciting to be able to share a story from our number one Patreon,
Dr. Ned.
He gets a shout out in every single episode because he's at the level of Patreon commitment where we make sure we talk about the cool stuff he does every single week. Dr. Ned, thank you so much for all your support.
And also Chuck's story, my gosh, What a traumatizing thing to happen to a kid.
Right, the closet of terror when you're 6 years old. But the thing is, I got to say, Wendy, what gets me really excited is the fact that in the past couple of weeks, we've added 3 new Patreons to the community.
I know, I'm excited about that too. It's really nice having our community grow when we're in this weird time of like being stuck at home and not able to perform out at venues, and it's just great. And so I'm happy to welcome our newest 3 Patreon members.
That's right. So, Christine, we want to welcome you to the See You on the Other Side and Sunspot Patreon community. Thank you so much. Eric, in addition to being a great guy to do shots with, welcome to the Sunspot and the See You on the Other Side Patreon community. And Stu. It is exciting that you've decided to join us, and it's our mission to bring you guys more fun songs and content and podcasts and all of those kind of things. So everybody, we just want to say, Christine, Eric, and Stu, you guys are, you're awesome, and we want to give you a very warm welcome for all you've done in joining.
Yes, we're looking forward to chatting with you in the Patreon Hangouts and in the secret Facebook group and getting your ideas and input for future shows.
And we're looking forward to spending more time on our Patreons as soon as we can. Now, we do a monthly hangout, special emails. Patreons get the downloadable versions of the songs that nobody else gets, and a discussion forum where we can talk about our favorite things, new paranormal news. Like, we used to have a paranormal newsletter, and we just moved putting paranormal stories right into the Facebook Patreon community because that's where we were getting the most feedback. If you're interested out there in Listenerland in joining our Patreon community, it's really easy to do. All you got to do is go to this website,
www.othersidepodcast.com/donate.
Become part of the coolest paranormal community on the internet, and we'll see you on the other side. Then I prayed to Jesus that night that he would join forces with Santa and kick the Easter Bunny's ass.